Welcome to the first part of the element of the poet. This part is prescribed for your syllabus. The second paper, that is in study of the poetry. It is an optional English paper. Let me tell you, in this part, we'll begin with the what is poetry and how to understand the poetry. The first part it begins with the explaining what is the poetry. Poetry, simply defined, is an ancient form of oral or literary expression that uses language differently from normal prose. The language which is used in the poetry is different from that of the prose. It is a non-normal use of language. Once Samuel Taylor Coleridge rightly says, I quote, that is prose, words in their best order, poetry, the best words in the best order. It means that poetry is the arrangement of the words in the best order, its best order. In minimum space, poet express his feelings in different ways. However, the poets and the critics from the ancient times to the present have attempted to define poetry as per their perception and understanding. They describe their understanding what is poetry in their own way. For example, Plato considered poetry as a copy of copy, or it's an imitation of an imitation. So it is twice removed from reality according to Plato. Let me explain it. When a poet feels something about an object, that is the first copy in his mind. And whatever is going on in his mind, later on, he write down on the paper in the form of a poetry. So that is the first copy in his mind and the second copy to the paper. So that is a twice removed from the reality. In the same way, his disciple Aristotle defined poetry as an act of imitation, but he differs to some extent. He says that poetry as an act of imitation, but not as the imitation of the object of the nature, but as the imitation of something far ideal and more noble. The great Elizabethan poet Sir Philip Sidney, in his defense of poetry, adored poetry, appreciated poetry, as I quote, poesy, therefore, is an art of imitation, or so Aristotle terms it in his word mimesis. That is to say, a representing, counterfeiting, or figuring for, to speak metaphorically, a speaking picture with this end to teach and delight. Unquote. The renowned romantic poet William Wordsworth, in his book Preface to the Lyrical Ballad, defines poetry as, I quote, poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility. It means that it takes its origin from emotion and recollected in tranquility. Unquote. While yet another great romantic poet, his counterpart, P.B. Shelley, Percy Bysshe Shelley, in his famous book Defense of Poetry, defines poetry as, I quote, the record of the best and the happiest moment of the happiest and the best man. Unquote. So by these definitions, we understand that everything is related with the emotion. Everything is, uh, attached to something else. They wanted to express their views about the poetry, and by that we came to know that it is one type of criticism of life. It is a reflection of the life in the form of a poetry. The great Victorian poet Matthew Arnold called poetry as, I quote, a criticism of life under the circumstances laid down for such criticism by the laws of poetic truth and poetic beauty, and defines it, I quote, simply the most beautiful, impressive, and widely effective mode of saying things, and hence its importance. In the 20th century, due to many reasons, but chiefly due to the growth of the scientific spirit, poet like Thomas Stern Eliot is very famous critic and poet, came with the different notion of the poet. For Eliot, poetry was a more work of intellect than sheer imagination. According to him, poetry is, I quote, as a turning loose of emotions, not a spontaneous overflow. He is against of the Wordsworth definition of the poetry. As Wordsworth defined poetry as a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, but Eliot has a different opinions about the poetry. He says that poetry is not an expression of personality, but rather an escape from personality. It means that the feelings, the agony of the poet, which he or she is undergoing, they wants to escape from these things, and that's why they wrote poetry, and that's in that sense that is the escape of the personality. Another trend in modern poetry is towards the composition of the free verse. That is another significant development in the poetry. Free verse having no rhyme scheme or a meter. However, the American poet Robert Frost commented on this form of poetry as, I quote, writing free verse is like playing tennis with the net down. So it is without net. It is no without any restrictions to follow. However, poetry has much loved, discussed, adored, debated, read, and enjoyed as a form of information. Many proverbs and maxims in our day-to-day life conversation came from the sun, great lines of the great poems. The greatness and value of the poetry can be aptly summarized in the following words of the Stephen Spinner. I quote, great poetry is always written by somebody straining to go beyond what we can do. So, in this way, we can say something about what is the poetry. In relation with this, I would like to explain how to understand a poetry. Understanding poetry is a very important thing. Poems are composed of certain rules and techniques. For a better appreciation of the poetry, it is necessary to know these rules, tools, and techniques of the poetic composition. We have to understand what are the rules behind that, what are the tools which are there used, and the techniques. Some of the basic elements of the poetry are theme, nation, image, figures of speech, sound pattern, and stanza forms. Understanding of a poem begins with the basic division of the elements, as of any literary work, in the two traditional broad categories, content and form. Content answers this question, what? For example, what is the subject matter of the poem? What is the theme? What is the message? For the conversation of the study, for the convenience of the study, the basic element of the poetry can be put under these two broad categories. Of the poetry broadly divided into two parts, that is content. Content comprises the theme, subject, and message which are therein. Message given by the poet. Then the biography also reflected in that part and the context. So this is the part relating with the content. Another category which is element of the poetry It is it can be explained by taking into consideration the 5 points. The first point is types of poetry. Which type of poetry it is? That is lyric, descriptive, narrative. The second one is a kind of poetry. Which type of poetry is that? Ode, elegy, sonnet, ballad, epic. Uh, the third part, which is that is the meaning of the poetry, diction, connotation, or denotation, figures of speech. So, by the help of these things, we can understand the meaning of the poetry. So, with the literal meaning as well as the meaning beyond the words, and the structure which is therein used, that is stanza forms. And the last, not the least, is the sound pattern of the poetry. Sound pattern includes rhyme, rhythm, and meter. This kind of division of the element of the poetry is made for the sake of convenience in understanding it. However, the relation between content and form is interdependent. Their relation is interdependent. They are attached with each, they are related with each other. So with this, so we comes to end with the first part, what is poetry and understanding the poetry. So these are the basic things to understand the poetry. In the next part, we'll deal elaborately with each part for up to that point. Thank you.